Well, what do you got for sports, Pete? Are you going to give us another Saquon Barkley-esque investment for the Vikings-Rams game, or what are you going to do?
Well, we had, as you said, John, we really did that pretty well last Thursday when we decided, even though the market was closed, we would just do an all sports thing, and it turned out pretty daggone well, I think, and we were pretty solid across the board. I would say this. Here's what I want to tell everybody. When you look at Wild Card Weekend, right? We've had this in front of us. We still have the Vikings tonight for Monday Night Football, but the Broncos. Now, the Broncos got their opening drive. They go right down the field. They score some points. They put up 7. They never scored anything after that, John. They lose 31-7. Here's the interesting part. They can't run the football. Bo Nix really didn't get much help. And, by the way, they ran 42 plays in this game to the 72 plays that Josh Allen was able to put together. And the running of Josh Allen, the running of the Buffalo Bills, that's what killed them. And that's going to be the theme that I'm going to go with, because we look at the Baltimore Ravens playing the Steelers, right? Steelers, people are pretty excited. We all love Tomlin. He is a great coach. I think a lot of people very much like him. I do. But I'll tell you this, give me Harbaugh and give me Derek, okay? I mean, if you want to get a guy who's going to run the football and you get the Ravens and you run for 300 yards on your opponent, John, you're probably going to have a pretty good day, I would say. And Derrick Henry only put up 186 yards yesterday running the football. Pittsburgh put up 29. So it's showing, I think, something that I've said about these GMs in the NFL. They're all a bunch of idiots, except for Baltimore, Philadelphia. I almost might even slide Minnesota in there because they went out and they picked up a running back who's pretty good from Green Bay, their rival.
I'd throw Detroit in there.
Absolutely. I mean, what did they do? Let's see. Everybody who goes for receivers except for Detroit, they go and get Jamar Gibbs in the first round. Well, turns out that he might not be such a bad running back, huh? And his sidekick, Montgomery. I mean, when you look at them, how do they do it? They run the ball. They run the ball to give themselves the opportunity to throw the ball. And that was something that's gotten lost in the last 6 or 8 years of the NFL, John. How about Green Bay, Philly? I don't know. Saquon goes out there and, he runs. He does okay. As a team, they run for 170 yards, John. Barkley, I can't even remember how many he had, but I know he got over 100 yards himself. So that's what I'm looking at right now. So I'd say this. With the Viking game tonight, it's going to be very tight, in my opinion. You've got Matthew Stafford over here, and you've got a very young quarterback in terms of what experience he's had. So you've got that going on, but you've got 2 very good running backs on each of these 2 teams. So I think it's going to be close. The Rams beat the Vikings pretty solidly in week 5, I think it was, when they played each other. But I think it's going to be a pretty close game. I think it's going to end up moving a little bit more for the Vikings, only because, John, if they're leaving because of the fires, which are horrific, and we know that, and they go to Arizona, where does the entire state of Minnesota go when it's time for the winter time to come? They want to get into the sun. They want to get away from the snow. The snowbirds are out. They go to Florida, but they really go to Arizona. That's going to be a Viking stadium, I think, tonight.
I think you're right, because so many snowbirds, as they're known, Pete, go to Florida. If they're from the Midwest, they go to the west side of Florida, Tampa, Sarasota, and so forth. And if they're from the East, generally, these are generalizations, they go to everything from Vero Beach all the way down to Miami. And that's just kind of the way it shakes out. From Minnesota, a lot of them go to Phoenix. So you're right. I think that will be, it will negate the edge that the Rams had as far as home field advantage. And I think your point, Pete, is so well taken. It's why Pete will probably be an NFL GM someday, folks, because when he talks about Saquon Barkley, or he talks about the King over there at Baltimore, when you're talking about teams that run the ball, and I'm putting Detroit in here, Pete, because all Laporta did, and that's another tight end out of Iowa, folks. Again, we've talked about him all year. But he set an NFL record for the first 2 seasons in the NFL. He had 144 receptions. How does that happen? Well, he's a great athlete. He gets open. But also, if you're slamming the ball in with Montgomery and Gibbs and all these guys that the Lions can put in the backfield, the linebackers have to cheat up. It always happens. And when that happens, you get a seam open for the tight end, and the tight end gets catches.
Yeah.
A lot of teams don't take advantage of that, Pete.
Yeah.
But I know that the Baltimore Ravens have in the past. Is it Andrews, Pete? Is that their tight end?
Yep.
Okay. Another great tight end. Tight ends become great because running backs are great. Wide receivers don't create great opportunities necessarily for running backs, especially if the O coordinator decides to try to target them like 12 times a game.
Yep.
Because as Pete just said, that would be 1/4 of all of the plays that some of these teams like, the Broncos run. So I think it's really important to pound the ball with the running backs, but not every play, of course. And that opens it up for the receivers, tight ends first, wide receivers, and slots second.
What I wanted to jump to next, John, is we've got it right in front of us now. We've been watching the NCAA playoffs. It's been absolutely phenomenal. You take a look at all these games, a lot of really good games. As a matter of fact, I thought there was a couple of nuggets that I wanted to throw out there, John. So you got the 12 team. This is the first year of doing it. Now, these guys who want to go to 16 are idiots. We don't need 16. 12 was fine. They keep wanting to get bigger, and everybody says, well, it's like basketball, they got 64. It's a different deal. It's a different sport. You don't want to do that to these players. It's too many games, I think, for college. But I would say this. How about this? The 4 teams that had byes were all eliminated. So that's one thing, getting into the quarterfinals. The top 4 ranked were all eliminated, the top 4, obviously the bye teams. And then all of a sudden you start getting a little bit further and a little bit further. Ohio State ends up beating Texas, right? 28-14. Why did they do that? Well, there was a strip sack. They were moving down the field. They were ready to get a little bit closer and a little bit closer to score and get this game, to get a pretty interesting game going. And what happens? All of a sudden, Jack Sawyer comes in. He comes in, gets the strip sack, runs the thing back, and that game is essentially over because of that. Then you've got Notre Dame and Penn State. Got a great quarterback with Alar. He gets out there, throws something that he doesn't do. He throws a poor pass. It's intercepted, and they lose to Notre Dame. And it's going to be a really interesting game, John. I know that everybody is leaning towards Ohio State, and I understand it because they have talent absolutely everywhere on that team. But there's something about what Notre Dame is doing and how I think they look like they are destined for something. Now, I'm not positive I think they win yet, although we'll get to that at some point, maybe later in the week. But it sure is interesting to see what they've been able to do, what Marcus Freeman is doing, and all the prayer and all these other things that go into what they're doing. The one thing that I'll point out that nobody really talked enough about, John, was Riley Leonard, the quarterback from Notre Dame, got hurt. And they were concerned about this guy, maybe even, concussion protocol. They did all that type of stuff. So they run in their second string quarterback. All he does is go down the field. He goes 6 for 7. He throws for 44 yards. They get a field goal. They put some points on the board. I think that was the turning point in the game, actually, that the backup quarterback was able to move him downfield, played perfectly, and put them in a position that Riley Leonard comes back. He's a great dual threat quarterback, John, and he did what he needed to do in the second half of that football game. I'll tell you what, Notre Dame just feels destined, but Ohio State is absolutely loaded. What do you think about this one early? And we can change our minds when it comes around right before the game.
Early on, I like Ohio State, but I don't like them as big as some people do, Pete.
Yep.
I also remember when Notre Dame used to not go after players. In my day, Pete, I think they picked up one player from junior college. Now, this Riley Leonard that you're talking about was a Duke guy, right?
Yep.
So, that's not to say that the coach isn't doing a great job. I think he is. And I think you've got to recognize the opportunities that the portal gives you. Because like you've said, Pete, the portal is like the free agency in the NFL. And NIL is like the salaries in the NFL. It's very similar. And I think in the coming years, you're going to see a lot more crossover with college and pro coaches, because it had been sort of an unwritten rule that even great coaches like Pete Carroll at the collegiate level couldn't do it at pro. And then, of course, he proved him wrong after making a couple mistakes in the pros. He went out to USC, crushed it, and then went up to Seattle and won a Super Bowl. So obviously, coaches can do that. I don't think Urban Meyer is in that category, but there's a lot of good coaches that can go either side. We'll see whether or not, Pete, your guy Belichick can really change things at North Carolina. They're not a bad program. North Carolina isn't, but I don't know if he's the answer. We'll have to see how long he's been away from kids that are, he's had to deal with a few of those kids at the pro level. Now he's going to deal with all of those kids. No veterans, just kids.
Well, it's an interesting thing too, John. When I look at Belichick, the one thing that I sort of the reasoning that I have is that it's almost pro football now, right? As you said, you got NIL. Well, you've got the big money, and you've got the salary cap in the NFL. And I want to push back on one of the guys on Twitter, John, who came at me. I said, they've got to fix this whole thing with NIL, and I said they've got to figure out a cap. And some guy goes, oh, you want to keep money away from these guys? That's a bullshit, and he went after me on that. And I'm like, okay, buddy, just so you understand, the NFL does have a cap. What is the most successful league there is in the world right now? Probably the NFL. I mean, you look at the numbers, they're off the charts. The NBA can't compete. The NHL can't compete. MLB, not even close to competing. And it's the NFL. But the reason is they've got a cap in place, which actually holds down from those that have all the money and want to spend all the money and those that don't. And it's all based upon the TV contract, right? I mean, so it makes total sense to me. Why don't they have a cap with this NIL? They need to do it, and they need to do it very quickly, John, because it will give the opportunity for the Minnesotas, maybe the Iowas of the world, to be able to compete with Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, the schools that have all that money. I mean, to me, it just makes common sense that maybe it's 20 million, maybe it's 25 million. Just have a cap. It doesn't even mean you have to get the whole cap, right? I mean, but if you do, if you've got that ability, then I think that makes sense. And I think that makes it far more fair for all the different schools to compete with one another. Otherwise, it's just the big get bigger, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, I tend to say that it's not a question of saying let's deprive these guys of the money that they are due. They fill the stadiums. The coaches don't fill the stadiums. Right. The players fill the stadiums. Now, the coaches got to do the right thing. And Ryan Day, to your point in the past, Pete, had failed pretty miserably against Michigan 4 times. Against Michigan, he hasn't been able to beat them. But the players on the field got to play. You got to put them in the right positions. They've got to understand what that team does against them and what they're going to do against that team. That's the coaching. But the players got to play.